The first offer came in a white SUV. Clean doors, dark windows. The kind of vehicle the first offer came in a white SUV. Clean doors, dark windows. The kind of vehicle that looks expensive even when it's standing still. It rolled up the dirt driveway just after sunrise, when a mist still sat low over the soybean field and the fence posts looked like they were floating. Elias Turner was at the cattle trough, one hand on the rusted handle, the other holding a coffee mug gone cold. He didn't wave, didn't hurry, just watched, because men in white SUVs never came to his farm to help. They came to buy something, or take something. By the time the engine shut off, the world around him looked divided in half. On one side, a small weathered farm, peeling red paint, a sagging porch, a tractor older than most office interns. On the other side, just beyond the fence line, machines the size of houses were already moving dirt for what would become one of the biggest commercial developments in the state. $2 billion. Warehouses, server buildings, distribution lanes, a private substation, a project so large people in town had started calling it the city behind the farm. And right in the middle of all that glass, steel, and money, sat Elias, 72 years old, boots caked with mud, flannel shirt buttoned wrong at the collar, quiet enough to make arrogant people nervous. The man from the SUV smiled before his shoes even touched the ground. That was the first lie. "Mr. Turner," he said, smoothing his tie like he'd practiced it, "we're hoping to make your life a whole lot easier." Elias looked at him for a moment, then at the envelope in his hand, then back at the rising concrete skeleton behind his north fence. He nodded once, slowly, like he already knew how this was going to go. What nobody in that SUV understood, not then, was that they hadn't built next to a weak old farmer. They had built next to a man who knew exactly what was buried under his own land, and what was locked behind the second gate. At first, the whole thing felt impossible. The scale of it, the noise, the speed. For 50 years, the Turner farm had been mostly the same. Spring planting, summer repairs, fall harvest, winter silence. The kind of place where time didn't move in months. It moved in fence repairs, diesel receipts, rainfall, and the price of feed. If you drove past too fast, you'd miss it. Just another aging farm on county land. Just another old man hanging on. And that was exactly why the developers made their first mistake. They looked at Elias the way cities look at old buildings. Too small, too old, too slow, temporary. He had lived on that land longer than some counties had kept digital records. He knew where the ground stayed soft after hard rain. He knew which oak tree leaned first in a storm. He knew which section of fence his father built crooked after breaking 2 fingers in 1961 and refusing to stop working. He knew every rut in the old back trail, every buried line, every gate, especially the gates. But to the men in the trailers and pressed shirts, none of that mattered. What mattered was acreage, position, access, and timing. Always timing. The project had been announced 18 months earlier with a press conference 20 miles away in a hotel ballroom full of cameras. There had been speeches about jobs, economic growth, regional transformation, a once-in-a-generation investment. People clapped at phrases they didn't really understand. Numbers were thrown around like confetti. 6,000 jobs, 4 million square feet, a multi-phase corporate campus, tax incentives, logistics integration, advanced storage, data infrastructure. The news anchor smiled. The mayor smiled. The county board smiled hardest of all. And out on his porch, Elias watched the whole thing on a television with a bent antenna and said only one sentence. "They're going to regret rushing that." His daughter, Claire, heard him and laughed. Not because it was funny, because that was how he said almost everything serious. Quietly, like a man talking to weather. Claire lived in Lexington, taught 8th grade science, and called him every Tuesday and Friday, whether he answered or not. She worried about him. Not in the dramatic way people post online. In the real way. The grocery lists left on the counter. The medicine bottles checked when she visited. The arguments about hiring help. The way she noticed he had started standing up slower after her mother died. 3 years earlier, he'd lost Helen. 46 years married. She had been the kind of woman who folded grocery bags flat, remembered everybody's birthday, and could stop an argument just by looking over the top of her glasses. After the funeral, the house changed. Not all at once. That's not how grief works. It changes by subtraction. One chair too empty. One voice gone from the kitchen. One light not turned on. Elias didn't talk much before. After Helen, he talked even less. But he stayed. Same house. Same porch. Same land. And every Tuesday and Friday, Claire would ask, "You doing okay?" And every Tuesday and Friday, he'd say, "Still upright." That was his version of honesty. The developers arrived in pieces. First the surveyors, then the legal mail, then the appraisers, then the polite men, then the less polite ones. They bought the Dixon parcel to the east, the Granger parcel to the north, 2 old poultry lots, a closed lumber yard, a mechanic's yard, a low marsh parcel everyone used to avoid because it flooded every third spring. Piece by piece, the project spread until the Turner farm looked less like a farm and more like an island somebody had forgotten to erase. Elias got offers early. Good money by local standards. Terrible money by theirs. At first they framed it like an opportunity. Retire easy. Move somewhere comfortable. No more upkeep. No more taxes. No more storms to worry about. As if he hadn't spent his whole life surviving exactly those things. As if comfort was the highest goal a man could have. He read the first offer at the kitchen table in silence. Folded it back into the envelope. Set under the sugar jar. Never called. The second offer was bigger. The third came with a relocation specialist. The fourth came with a consultant who said, in a voice too smooth to trust, "We'd hate for you to be the last holdout in a changing area." That was the first time Elias smiled. A real smile. Small. Sharp. "The last holdout," he repeated. The consultant nodded, thinking he was getting through. Elias looked past him, out the window, toward the southern fence. "Son," he said softly, "this place was here before your company had a logo." The consultant stopped smiling. That happens sometimes when people realize they aren't speaking to a confused old man. They're speaking to someone who has simply decided not to cooperate. And still, if you ask people in town back then, most of them would have told you Elias was going to sell. Eventually. Everybody does, they said. That kind of money changes things. Besides, what's one farmer going to do against a $2 billion project? It was a fair question, because from the road, it looked hopeless. The construction got louder. Trucks started before dawn. Backup alarms screamed all day. Dust settled on his porch rail, his mailbox, the hood of his pickup. The sky at night stopped being dark. Huge temporary lights turned the horizon white. Even the cows got uneasy. For the first time in years, Elias started locking both front gates before bed. Not because he thought someone would steal anything, because he understood what comes before force. Pressure. Always pressure first. He also started checking the old file cabinet in the mudroom. Not every day, but enough. Second drawer. Brown folders. Property tax records. Deeds. Maps. Survey copies. Letters with county seals. The sort of paperwork most families lose after one move or one death. Helen had made him keep everything. That was her rule. If it touches land, she used to say, tapping papers into neat stacks, it lives in a folder. At the time, he'd rolled his eyes. Now, 3 years after burying her, he stood in the mudroom, running his thumb over her handwriting on the labels. North boundary, drainage, road access, utility correspondence, and one older folder, thicker than the rest, edges soft from use, marked in black ink. West service entry. That was the one he kept pulling halfway out, then sliding back in. Not yet. The first real problem hit the developers in phase 2. Not on the news. Not publicly. Those problems are always hidden first. Inside conference calls. Emails labeled urgent. Voices lowered behind glass walls. By then, the outer structures were up. Steel frames. Concrete pads. Utility corridors. The project looked unstoppable. That's the dangerous stage. When money starts believing it's already won. Then came the inspection review. Fire access. Emergency circulation. Heavy vehicle egress. A site this big, with that much storage, that much traffic, that many employees could not rely on a single primary access route. Not legally. Not safely. Not once the final occupancy review came through. They needed a second full-service entry. Wide enough, stable enough, recorded and enforceable. The maps they counted on didn't solve it cleanly. One route cut through protected wetland mitigation. One would require a bridge they hadn't budgeted. One crossed rail coordination that could take 18 months. And one, the easiest one, ran along the old Turner boundary. Not through the middle of his farm, just the western edge. An old gravel service path most people assumed was useless. A forgotten line tucked behind hedges and a stand of cedar. A route ending a rusted chain gate most employees driving by never even noticed. The second gate. Except Elias noticed it. Every day. Because his father had built it. And his grandfather had insisted it stay deeded, surveyed, and accessible even after the county abandoned the original feeder road in 1954. People forgot why. Families don't. Not if they know how land really works. Long before highways shifted and industrial parks swallowed fields, that west service entry had mattered. It was how seed got in when the south road flooded. How cattle trailers got out in ice. How a fire truck reached the barn in 1978 after lightning took half the roof. Later it stopped being practical. Then it became invisible, which is not the same thing as unimportant. That difference would soon cost somebody a fortune. The county planner called first. Friendly voice. Careful tone. Too careful. He said there were emerging site coordination matters. Elias stood in his workshop, sanding the splintered handle of an old rake while the man talked in circles. When the planner finally mentioned possible access cooperation, Elias set the rake down. Who sent you? A pause. Then, well, the development team is concerned about some. Who sent you? Longer pause. Caro Development. There it was. Names matter. Once you get a name, the masks get thinner. Caro Development was the face. But everybody knew the real money sat behind holding companies, regional funds, and a national logistics client no one would name out loud yet. That's how big projects protect themselves. Layers. Like an onion, if onions bill by the hour. Elias asked only one more question. How much are they behind? The planner hesitated again, which was answer enough. Sir, I wouldn't characterize it that way. Elias gave a low grunt. He'd heard that sound from livestock buyers bluffing weight. Course you wouldn't. Then he hung up. That evening Claire drove down after work. 3-hour round trip. She found him on the porch with 2 manila folders and a legal pad. When she saw the papers, she knew something had changed. Because Elias hated paperwork almost as much as he hated dentists. What happened? He told her. Not dramatically. Just the facts. Development needed secondary access. They were circling back. County making calls. Probably more soon. Claire sat down slowly. You knew this might happen. He took a moment. Thought it might. You thought it might? He shrugged. That old man shrug. Half modesty. Half strategy. Helen thought it would. Claire turned. What? And there, for the first time, he pulled the thick folder fully onto the porch table. West Service entry. Inside were copies of old plats. A 1954 county realignment memo. A 1978 emergency response letter, a 1989 survey update, and, clipped inside a yellowing sleeve, a legal notation preserving private agricultural ingress and egress rights over the West Service lane, with width requirements wider than Claire expected. Wider by enough to matter. A lot. She looked up at him. He wasn't smiling. He was looking out toward the darkening field where the glow from the construction site bled into the sky. You didn't tell them. No. You didn't tell anybody. Didn't need to. Claire stared at the papers again. Then at the development lights. Then back at her father. And for maybe the first time in her adult life, she saw him not as stubborn, not as old-fashioned, but as patient, dangerously patient. What are you going to do? Elias leaned back in the porch chair. It creaked under him. Wait. That was all. And somehow it sounded heavier than a threat. Waiting turned out to be expensive. For them. Not him. The next offer arrived 3 days later. Higher by enough to look serious. Still nowhere near serious enough. This time they asked for only the western strip. A partial acquisition. A clean easement package. Fast closing. Confidentiality language. Temporary construction rights. Future utility accommodation. Lawyers write greed in very polite sentences. Claire read it at the table and laughed once. Not kindly. They think you're desperate. Elias was buttering toast. They think I'm old. Same thing to them. He nodded. That part was true. They assumed time itself was on their side. That age softens resolve. That noise, paperwork, and pressure eventually wear down anybody living alone. So they turn the pressure up. Small things at first. Construction trucks idling too close to his line. Survey stakes appearing where they shouldn't. A rumor floated in town that the county might revisit certain zoning and nuisance complaints. Then a man from the utility subcontractor knocked on Elias's door and said they need to verify some edge conditions near the west side. Elias asked, "You got permission?" The man blinked. "No, sir, but I was told." Elias opened the door wider, just enough for the man to see the shotgun hanging on the mudroom pegs. "Didn't touch it. Didn't need to." "Then you were told wrong." The man left. Fast. That night Claire told him to get an attorney. He said no. She said, "Dad, this isn't 1975. He said, "That's exactly why I don't want one first." She stared. He wiped his hands on a dish towel. "If I hire one now, they know I'm moving." She hated when he was right like that. A week later, they sent 2 attorneys. That's when he called his own. Mara Leland. County raised. Sharp. No patience for corporate theater. Her grandfather and Elias had once traded hay equipment for 6 seasons without writing a contract because handshakes used to mean things around here. Mara came on a Sunday afternoon in jeans and boots and spent 4 hours at the kitchen table. By the end of it, she had the file stack spread like a battlefield. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. "Have they seen all of this?" "No. Any of it. Bits." Mara sat back. Then she did something Claire didn't expect. She smiled. Not a warm smile. A professional one. The kind people wear when the numbers just shifted hard in their favor. "Good," she said. Then quieter. "Let them keep underestimating you. Here's the thing about power. Most people think it looks loud. Big offices. Aggressive voices. Deadlines. Threats. But real power, the kind that changes outcomes, usually starts hidden. On paper. In timing. In details. Everybody else was too impatient to study. Caro had land. Capital. Political support. Speed. What Elias had was worse. Leverage. And leverage gets stronger when the other side is in a hurry. Mara confirmed what he already suspected. The West Service Lane wasn't just sentimental old farm access. It was recordable, defendable, and structurally suitable for upgrade. More importantly, under revised occupancy and emergency management requirements, a compliant second access route wasn't optional theater. It was functionally tied to final operational approval for major sections of the site. Could Caro redesign around it? Eventually. Could they do it cheaply? No. Could they do it quickly? Not even close. Every alternative meant delay. Permitting. Regrading. Wetland complications. Traffic redesign. New environmental review. Months. Maybe more. And on a project where financing, tenant commitments, and construction sequencing were all chained together, months didn't cost inconvenience. They cost blood. Contractor penalties. Holding costs. Political embarrassment. Public market whispers. That's the part people in town never see. A billion-dollar project can look indestructible from the highway and still be one delayed signature away from panic. Mara told him they're not buying a strip of dirt anymore. Elias nodded. They're buying time. Mara looked at him over the papers. No, she said. Now they're renting mercy. Claire almost choked on her coffee. Even Elias let out a low laugh at that one. The next meeting happened in a temporary project office overlooking the construction yard. Glass walls. Printed renderings. A fake bowl of limes in the conference room because corporate offices always seem to believe fruit makes bad news easier. Elias wore the same brown jacket he wore to feed stores and funerals. Claire came with him. Mara too. Across from them sat 3 executives, 2 attorneys, and a man introduced only as operations lead, which usually means the one person in the room actually losing sleep. They opened with courtesy, appreciation, community partnership language, respect for heritage. You can always tell when someone's about to ask for something expensive. They start complimenting your history. Then came the revised offer. Bigger. Much bigger. Enough money that half the county would have signed before the sentence ended. Claire looked at her father. He didn't even touch the paper. One executive leaned forward. "We believe this is a generous resolution." Elias looked at him, then at the rendering on the wall behind him. Sleek roads, loading lanes, landscape medians, clean geometry. A future built by people who thought straight lines meant control. "No," Elias said. The room went still. The executive cleared his throat. "Perhaps you'd like time to review." "I reviewed it when you parked." Mara folded her hands to hide a smile. The operations lead spoke next. He was younger than the others and looked more tired. "Mr. Turner, we do need a practical path here." "You had one," Elias said. The man frowned. "When?" "Before you poured concrete, before checking every boundary that mattered." One of the attorneys jumped in. "We've conducted extensive diligence." Elias turned his head slowly and looked at him. Just looked. It was amazing how many expensive people became less confident under silence. The attorney stopped talking. Then Mara slid a document across the table. Not dramatic, just precise. Survey references, recorded rights, emergency access relevance, historical use evidence, conditional implications. The executive skimmed, then slowed down, then actually started reading. You could feel the room change, the way a barn changes before storm. No one said anything for several seconds. The operations lead spoke first. "Quietly now. You've had this the whole time." Elias answered without blinking. "It's my land. Course I have." No one used the word mistake. Powerful people almost never do. But from that point on, the tone shifted. They were no longer managing an elderly holdout. They were negotiating with a gatekeeper. Literally. After that, the offers stopped being insulting. They also stopped being simple. Money increased. Then additional acreage purchase requests disappeared. Now, they wanted a structured access agreement, then a permanent easement, then a licensing deal during phased improvements, then limited utility rights, then indemnity caps, then confidentiality again. The number kept rising, but so did the complexity. That told Mara everything. They weren't just under schedule pressure. They were internally split. Somebody above wanted the problem gone fast. Somebody below was trying not to set a precedent. Somebody in legal hated the exposure. And somebody in finance had already started calculating what each week of delay was burning. Elias, meanwhile, kept doing ordinary things. Feeding cattle, repairing fence, replacing a busted pressure switch, watching weather. That contrast unsettled them even more. Because frantic people hate dealing with calm people. Calm feels like control. One Tuesday, while trucks lined up by the dozens outside the rising complex, Claire found her father in the barn oiling an old hinge. She stood there a second just watching. "Do you even feel nervous?" He kept working. "Sure. You don't look nervous." He tested the hinge. Metal gave a low groan. Then he said, "Being nervous ain't the same as being rushed." That line stayed with her. Because it explained him. Maybe his whole life. After Mom died. After drought years. After debts. After market crashes. After every funeral and every lean season. He was nervous plenty. He just never handed that feeling to other people. That was part of his strength. Maybe the main part. The story started leaking around town, of course. These things always do. First in fragments. Then in versions. Then in dramatic nonsense. By the second month, people at the diner were saying Elias on the whole back road. Then that he had them by the utilities. Then that he could shut the project down with one phone call. That last part wasn't exactly true. Reality is usually less cinematic and more expensive. But for the first time since the development began, public sympathy bent toward him. Why? Not because people suddenly hated growth. Because they recognized disrespect when they saw it. Most folks around there had met some version of a Caro executive before. The kind of person who mistakes local quiet for local ignorance. The kind who says we're excited to invest in this community while trying to pressure widowers off inherited land. That kind always overplays its hand. At church parking lots and gas stations, people started saying things like, "Good for him." Or, "About time somebody slowed them down." Or, best of all, maybe they should have asked nicer the first time. That one made Claire laugh when she heard it. Because it was exactly right. This whole thing might have ended cheaply if they had opened with respect. Instead, they open with condescension. That's a tax too. A hidden one. And eventually it comes due. The hardest part came later. Not during the offers. During the doubt. Because there's always doubt. Even when you're right. Especially when you're right and the number in front of you keeps getting bigger. One night, Claire stayed over and found Elias sitting alone at the kitchen table long after dark. No TV. No radio. Just a yellow legal pad and one lamp on. What is it? He didn't answer at first. Then, your mother would have known where to stop. Claire pulled out the chair across from him. He looked older that night. Not weaker. Just tired in a way that reached deeper than sleep. Dad. He tapped the pen against the page. Too little first, too much now. That was the real pressure point. Not greed. Judgment. How do you know when holding your ground is principle and when it becomes ego? How do you know when enough is enough? That's the part nobody romanticizes. The private part. The part where a person has to live with the choice long after the cheering stops. Claire looked at the pad. He'd written columns. Money. Restrictions. Road work. Future liability. Farm use impact. Privacy. Then, at the bottom, one line by itself. What would keep the land honest? She read it twice. Then looked up. I think, she said carefully, you already know what you care about. He waited. She glanced toward the window, with a glow from the project washed across the field. You don't want to be forced out, she said. But you also don't want to spend the rest of your life fighting them. He nodded once. Exactly. That was it. He didn't need to crush them. He needed them to admit the truth with their check and their signatures. That the farm had never been small in the way they meant. Only quiet. The final negotiation happened 6 weeks before the first major occupancy milestone. That mattered. Everybody knew it mattered. Deadlines make truth speak faster. This time the meeting wasn't in their office. It was at Elias's farm. His choice. They sat on the back porch because he refused to host them at the kitchen table and bring corporate trouble into Helen's house. There were no renderings out here. No polished floors. No climate control home. Just a screen door that clicked wrong, cicadas starting up in the trees, and the smell of cut hay drifting in from the south lot. Sometimes setting matters more than argument. People speak differently when they're standing on someone else's ground. The Caro team arrived trimmed down. That told Mar negotiations were real now. 2 executives. 1 lead attorney. The operations guy again. And someone new. Gray suit. No introduction beyond a first name. Too quiet. Too attentive. The kind of man who represents money far above the local chain. They made their final proposal. And for the first time, it sounded less like an acquisition and more like surrender disguised as structure. A substantial payment for the West Service easement. An annual access fee. All improvement costs paid by Caro. Drainage protections. Noise barriers. Privacy fencing on portions of the upgraded corridor. Agricultural use protections for the rest of the Turner property. No utility expansion beyond defined limits without future compensation. And this mattered most. The Turner residence and central farm acreage would remain untouched. No forced future option. No creeping rights. No quiet takeover later. Claire watched her father's face while the terms were read. Nothing. No reaction. But she knew him well enough by then. He was listening hardest when he looked least impressed. Mara asked questions. Sharp ones. About maintenance. Liability. Transfer restrictions. Enforcement. Default conditions. The attorney answered. The gray-suited man answered twice when the attorney hedged. That told them who had real authority. Eventually, the conversation slowed. Wind moved through the trees. A truck down the road shifted gears. The operations lead glanced toward the western boundary, toward the overgrown lane, toward the gate. Still locked. Still rusted. Still ordinary-looking enough that a stranger would never imagine millions were hanging on its hinges. Then the gray-suited man turned to Elias. What would make this acceptable? There it was. At last. A real question. Not pressure. Not framing. Not salesmanship. Just truth with a necktie. Elias set his coffee down. He took his time, because timing is part of the answer. Then he said, you build that road, you build it right. No one interrupted. You don't cut corners on drainage. You don't flood my lower field. You don't touch the oak line. You don't run trucks after hours past that bend. And you put in writing that when I'm gone, my daughter doesn't spend 10 years fighting people who think paper means whatever their newest lawyer says it means. Claire looked at him quickly. He didn't look back. The gray-suited man nodded once. That can be done. Elias held his gaze. Then the price changes. Of course it did. Final numbers were exchanged, then revised, then narrowed, then written. And when it was done, Mara read everything twice. Not once, twice. Because this wasn't just a payout. It was a correction, a recorded one, signed on paper, enforceable by people who bill for every minute. When the last page was ready, the sun had nearly dropped. Orange light sat across the field. The project beyond the fence buzzed and flashed and rumbled, but out on the porch for a second, it was strangely quiet. The gray-suited man extended a hand. Elias looked at it, then took it. One firm shake. Nothing more. No speech. No grin. No victory lap. Just business. Finally done honestly, because dishonesty had become too expensive. Then Elias stood, walked down the porch steps, and headed toward the west side of the property. Everyone watched. The others followed at a distance, not speaking. Boots over dry grass, gravel underfoot, past the cedar stand, past the old fence turn, until they reached it. The second gate, old iron, rust along the latch, chain looped through twice, half hidden by years of vines and neglect. A gate so unimpressive it almost looked symbolic. And maybe it was. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small ring of keys. Not many, just 3. He chose one without hesitation, slid into the lock, paused, not for effect, for memory. Maybe he was seeing his father's hands there. Maybe Helen labeling folders in the mudroom. Maybe every person who had ever told him to give in because he was outnumbered. Then he turned the key. The lock clicked. Metal gave. The chain dropped with a sound that seemed much louder than it was. He pulled the gate open, slowly. On the hinge, he had oiled himself. And behind it, the old service lane stretched out toward the county spur, straight and usable and legally alive the whole time. No magic, no fantasy, no hidden gold. Just land, records, patience, and a man who understood both better than the people who tried to corner him. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. They didn't need to. The power had already shifted, not in some dramatic movie way, in the real way, the signed way, the paid way, the irreversible way. The empire next door was still worth billions. But in that moment, all of it had to pass respectfully through a gate owned by the farmer they thought would fold first. Construction on the access road began 3 months later. Professionally, carefully, more carefully than anything else on the project, probably. That happens when a lesson gets expensive enough. The drainage was done right. The oak line stayed. Traffic restrictions held. The privacy berm went in. So did the fencing. Mara made sure every clause had teeth. Claire made sure copies of everything lived in 3 places because apparently she had become her mother. And Elias? Elias kept farming. Mostly. He leased out a small portion later. Sold some cattle. Fixed the barn roof. Finally replaced the porch steps everyone had nearly died on since 2009. He even bought a newer truck, though he complained about too many buttons for the next 6 months. People in town kept expecting him to act different. He didn't. That disappointed some of them. They wanted a folk hero, a legend, a man transformed by victory. But real people rarely become symbols in neat ways. He was still Elias, still quiet, still suspicious of men who smiled too early, still drinking coffee gone cold. The money helped, yes. Claire worried less. The farm had breathing room. Taxes weren't a monthly ache anymore. And when she asked him once if it felt good, really good, to know he'd beaten them at their own game, he gave her the kind of answer only he could give. Didn't beat them, he said. Just made them stop lying about the price. That was the line, wasn't it? That was the whole story. Not revenge. Not greed. Recognition. The world loves pretending small things are weak just because they're quiet. A small farm. An old widower. A rusted gate. A folder in a drawer. But sometimes the thing everybody overlooks is the one thing holding the whole machine together. And the people who understand that, they don't panic. They wait. Years later, Drivers use the access road every day without knowing the story. Delivery vans, safety trucks, maintenance crews, shift workers late for badge scans. Most of them never looked twice at the Turner boundary. Never knew how close the whole project came to a far more expensive redesign. Never knew the old gate remained there, upgraded now, but still sitting on the same line where Elias's father had once hung it. Claire knew. Mara knew. A few county people knew. And maybe that was enough. Some stories don't need a statue. They just need to be remembered correctly. Elias died at 81. At home, in his chair by the window, spring rain on the roof. Claire found, among his things, a note folded into the West Service entry folder. One sentence in his handwriting. Crooked as ever. Never sell the quiet too cheap. That line stayed with her. Maybe because it wasn't just about land. It was about people too. About dignity. About patience. About not confusing gentleness with surrender. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a fight is the person who doesn't rush to speak. And sometimes the strongest move isn't building the empire. It's knowing when to unlock the gate. So here's the question. If $1 billion company offered you life-changing money for a piece of land, but you knew waiting could change everything, would you take the first offer? Or would you hold the line and see what they were really afraid of? Let me know in the comments.